venture capitalists investing in these programs, that was cause for alarm for us. We started to read about how the programs were marketed. And to give you some examples, if you go online, you can find a number of these, and often they describe themselves in, as I said, sort of nurturing language, very non-medicalized kinds of orientations that are very much focused on the beauty of nature and the opportunities of being in a more outdoors education kind of a setting. And so we were seeing that the actual marketing of these programs was framing them in a particular way. I will say, though, that many of the websites are also very explicit in saying that we are a great program for youth with, and then sort of a laundry list of psychiatric diagnoses, and some other things sprinkled in like adoption issues, or many of the programs refer to troubled teens. That was sort of a term that was used. And so what we were hearing again in the literature was that the services that were being delivered were not consistent with the ways that the programs were being described. And in fact, kids were not getting the kind of education or the kind of therapeutic interventions that the families were expecting when they signed up for these programs, which sometimes cost, we've heard accounts of, $30,000 to $50,000 a year, and families using their kids' college savings, getting second mortgages on their homes in order to afford these programs that are not funded by, insurance or public sector funding. But that, in fact, they weren't getting that kind of treatment, and that there were a number of practices that really did sound both abusive and very much not in keeping with practice standards with regard to seclusion and restraint. And also some strategies that are not so typical, that are escort services or transport services. So there's this other industry now of programs that will come to a family's house in the middle of the night and awaken a teenager in their pajamas and handcuff them and take them out and transport them on an airplane to a program across the country. And parents are paying for the privilege to have this happen. Uh-huh. Yes. Yes, absolutely. I mean, that sounds like exactly the kind of program that this is about, and that there are some American companies that have programs in Costa Rica and in Jamaica and some other countries. Interestingly, the programs in other countries, those countries have tended to shut the programs down, whereas in the United States, there are these same companies still operating programs. Uh-huh. Right. Even if there was any benefit. Yeah, and I think that this is what many youth have described, is that it is a terrifying experience, and it's really confusing to try to understand how is it that my parents would choose to do this, and then not to have the opportunity in many cases, as we'll discuss, to even have the conversation with one's family to understand how it is that this was considered the best approach. And at the same time, I, have encountered a whole bunch of people who are oriented with this sort of complex industry over the last few years. And one person I spoke with is a young man who, with his brother, has one of these transport services in Utah, which tends to be a really large, it's a state with a number of programs. And he said that both he and his brother attended these kinds of programs when they were teenagers, and that the experience of attempting to get his younger brother to this program with his family itself, he used the words that it was traumatizing, and that's why they decided to create a transport service, because they felt like it was better than the kind of grappling that happened in the back seat while they were trying to keep his brother from jumping out the car when he knew he was on his way to a residential facility. So it's a dilemma. I think families feel like they don't know how they could get their kids to such a program, and so it seems like this would be an option for them, and yet, understandably, as you said, the potential impact on youth.
Did they say whether or not they were trained mental health professionals to get into this
Right.
program?
This is not a...
It's one experience in their background, and they were going to try to make it right.
The transport operators. The transport operators, it's sort of an emerging profession that doesn't have any standards, and so there aren't necessarily any training expectations, although some might pursue training and restraints and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's not something that's typical for kids who go to inpatient psychiatric facilities or residential treatment centers. It's really a phenomenon that has grown up corresponding with these sort of alternative residential facilities. And then I think some of the things that were really concerning to us as we learn more about these programs is that, unlike psychiatric institutions or residential treatment centers that are registered with the state, many of these programs call themselves private boarding schools, and as such, in many states, are not accountable for any of these practices to anyone. And so it has been possible across the country for this phenomenon to blossom or to manifest, because a lot of the things that we would just know you absolutely could not do in a licensed residential treatment center are happening in these programs. And of course, again, families are assuming that since there are laws, rules, and regs for a certain cadre of residential facilities, why wouldn't those extend to all? And so it's oftentimes absolutely sort of blindsiding families. So, so to tell the story of, so what do? I mean, you encounter, you find out about a phenomenon like this, and you think, my gosh, where do we even begin? So one of the things that we did was we thought, well, okay, yes, as social scientists, we would typically say, well, we need data. We need sufficient data to substantiate these claims. How do we know that these aren't sort of anecdotal reports that are sort of exaggerated accounts? And yet, when we did read that set of articles, a coherent sort of description of this phenomenon that really was hanging together, it became apparent. And so we decided, well, we will write a summary of what we have been coming to understand through the journalistic efforts to date. And there is a Children, Youth, and Families office at the APA, the American Psychological Association, and it has an online sort of quarterly journal, and we had an opportunity to submit something to that, and so we said, well, why don't we submit to this? And, even still today, it is the case probably that online, I mean, this was not necessarily a peer-reviewed product, and might not be considered as as impactful as something that's more rigorously reviewed. And yet, I think the fact that we ensured that something was out there in the internet cyberspace.